Okay, this is a warning. We're going to talk about snakes. Right. So gird yourselves. I see you, Dorcas.
About what? We can't hear
Snakes. I'm not sure anybody in the world hated snakes more than my mother. My dear mother simply could not abide snakes. You couldn't even say the word snake or make the sound, but that she would shriek and squirm. I remember one day when we lived in Miami, Florida, an iguana wandered into our home through our porch. Oh my. She jumped up onto a chair like Superman, and she screamed for it to get out. She could not stand the sight of a snake or anything snake-like. Now her heartless sons would use that from time to time to distract and trouble her to no end. And I want to assure you, it being Lent, that I have repented of that. And so I know that I know exactly what she would have thought about our readings today. She would not have wanted to talk about it at all, but we need to. The book of Numbers recounts how the Hebrews acted toward God and his prophet Moses not long after they had been delivered from their bondage in Egypt. They quickly became discouraged and complained bitterly against God and Moses. Oh, they detested the food that God provided. The one true living God did not meet their standards, and so they made new ones. And then they went further. They lost their appreciation for and faith in God, and they began to follow their own path. To use the words of the confession of sin in morning prayer rite 1, they followed too much the devices and desires of their own hearts, and they offended against his holy laws. In prophetic language, they committed adultery against God. And as a consequence, for there are always consequences when we substitute God's will with ours, as a consequence, the Lord sent poisonous serpents to punish them. It's a disturbing story. And right about this point, I imagine my mother would be squirming right out of her skin. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul calls us to see ourselves in this story. It is an awful thing to look at our own ugly sins. So much is obviously wrong in the world, so much violence, so much rancor, so many divisions, so much fear and disappointment. Our Lenten project has been to go below the surface to articulate the ways in which we have offended against God so that we can make a new start. The ways in which we make ourselves the center of the world, crown ourselves as God, and robe ourselves as judge. How we violate the Sabbath, or our convenient lies that we use to navigate around the awkward issues, the turning of a blind eye to mass murder and violence across the world and down the street, the pursuit of pleasure and goods because others have them. All of these amount to following the devices and desires of our own hearts. I want to mention a movie that I've not seen that a parishioner recommended called Zone of Interest. And I haven't seen it yet, but it is about a family that makes their home adjoining the gate of Auschwitz during the execution of Jews in the Second World War. It's a ghastly sight, really, if you think about it, to make a comfortable upper middle class home with children, a pool, a solarium and gardens, vines and roses, when the wall that you share next to it is mass murder happening. I encourage you all to see it. I'm going to see it as soon as it comes out. Zone of interest. Because it tells us about the things, the conviction that we should have about things that we distance ourselves from but ought not to. And so I think it should be out shortly, and I encourage you to see this. Are these our snake bites, our death from poisoning? Are we suffering the consequences of our collective infidelity? It's easy to see how many would feel like God is either punishing us or has abandoned us altogether. But for this, God so loved the world. There are no more hopeful words than these. God so loved the world. The conviction of our sins is not the condemnation of our souls. For our conviction is also our diagnosis. And where there is a diagnosis, there can also be a cure. God told Moses that cure would be to make a bronze snake and put it on the end of a pole, and have the people who wanted to live to gaze upon it. The instrument of death would be the instrument of salvation. This strange talisman would be the antidote for the snake venom inflicted as a consequence for their sins. So God loved the Hebrews, so much so that he gave them a cure if they would accept it. The snake has been a symbol of healing since ancient Greece. Perhaps they borrowed their god that they made to be the god of healing from this story in Numbers. We don't really know the direct connection, if there was one. But the ancients marveled at how serpents could shed their skins and take on new life, as it were. That their venom was not only a poison, but also useful for many medical remedies. Some species could even self-propagate. Amazing. The snake wrapped around a wooden rod is known as the rod of Asclepius. The rod of Asclepius, and it is a prominent symbol in medicine. That's what you'll see. That's the rod of Asclepius, the snake around the pole. When I lived in Miami, where the iguana scared my mother, there was a world-famous serpentarium. You know what a serpentarium is just by the name. It's just down the street from where we lived. God help my mother. It's a place full of snakes, hundreds of snakes. My brothers and I would go there to watch Dr. Bill Haast catch king cobras and rattlesnakes by his hand and then milk them for their venom. Dr. Haast loved snakes as much as my mother hated them. Haast so loved snakes, he loved them so much that he would even allow himself to be bitten. But he did not do it for the fun of it, but in order to make the venom into anti-venom, in order to save lives. This is exactly what the cross of Christ is to us. Like the snake on a pole, Christ on the cross is our antidote. Jesus lifted on the cross is both the symbol of our sins, for the very Son of God was tortured and murdered on it, and it is the means of our salvation. I hope we will all gaze upon the filth of our sins and its consequences, and that we don't blink and see them nailed to the cross along with Jesus. Hold it in our sight, in our mind's eye, in our prayers, and in our conscience. That's what our Lenten work is about. In church tradition today, the fourth Sunday in Lent is what is called Laetare Sunday. Laetare, Laetare. It is Latin, and it means to rejoice. Notice the beautiful roses on the altar today. Do you see that? In memory of Randy Hensley. They're beautiful roses, and they are a divergence from the usual evergreens and muted flowers of the season, because along our Lenten journey, we must not forget that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son for our salvation, and he loves us still. It is a day to remember that our sins are real, but to rejoice that sin is our diagnosis, but not our fate. So let us rejoice in our salvation by that cruel and wondrous cross.